At 07:12 on April 18, 1945, in the mist-covered outskirts of Magdeburg, the sun had barely pierced the smoke drifting across the shredded remains of the Elbe River bridges when the first column of American trucks rolled to a halt. Their olive-drab silhouettes rumbled like distant thunder, engines idling, exhaust hissing against the cold morning air. German civilians, thin, dust-covered, hollow-eyed from months of bombing and starvation, watched from cellar doors and shattered window frames. A few clutched children to their chests. Others gripped makeshift white flags. None dared move closer. They had heard the stories whispered through ruined neighborhoods. The Americans were coming, and no one knew whether they would bring fury or mercy. For many, the expectation was vengeance, a long-delayed settling of accounts after years of Nazi aggression. Yet what they saw instead defied everything they believed would happen. The lead truck's canvas flap lifted, revealing not weapons, not shackled prisoners, not bodies, but sacks of flour stacked to the roof. Behind them came crates of condensed milk, medical kits bearing red crosses, and steel canisters of powdered eggs. A sergeant barked orders through a crackling radio, the voice sharp and professional, echoing down the battered street where horse carcasses still lay frozen from last week's fighting. Nearby, the German civilians whispered in panic, insisting it must be a trick, that the Americans were luring them out for reprisals. One elderly man refused to come out at all, shielding his trembling wife from a threat he believed inevitable. But the Americans did not raise rifles. They formed a perimeter, marking a distribution line with white engineer tape, their movements efficient, precise, unmistakably restrained. Farther down the street, a young German boy, no more than 10, stepped forward, hunger overpowering fear. His ribs pressed against his thin shirt as he approached an American private stationed near the first aid tent. The private glanced to his lieutenant for permission, received a curt nod, and reached into his pack. What came out was a chocolate bar from an emergency K-ration kit, still wrapped in foil. The boy froze, unable to understand why such a gift would be offered by a soldier whose comrades had been fighting through German streets for months. That single gesture rippled through the watching crowd like a shockwave. Something was wrong, they thought. Something didn't fit. Why weren't these Americans acting like conquerors? Just hours earlier, artillery flashes had still illuminated the riverbank as remnants of the German 84th Infantry Division attempted a chaotic withdrawal. U.S. commanders expected resistance here, 2 scattered snipers or die-hard Volkssturm units. Instead, they encountered only silence and an overwhelming civilian presence, troops from the U.S. 30th Infantry Division reported that entire blocks emerged with white sheets, surrendering en masse in one of the largest spontaneous capitulations seen in central Germany. Yet even in surrender, the fear remained. In Berlin, Goebbels' propaganda machine had spent years spreading images of American cruelty, insisting that invading forces would annihilate German families as payback for the war. Civilians believed it. Many preferred hiding in cellars rather than face the enemy, but the orders flowing down from the headquarters of the U.S. Ninth Army were unmistakable. Madge, Gen. William Simpson, whose reputation for rigid discipline had become legend among staff officers, relayed instructions that stunned even some of his own frontline soldiers. Civilians were to receive immediate humanitarian aid. No looting, no revenge, no reprisals of any kind. Logistics officers, drawing on guidelines shaped months earlier by planning staffs under Gen. George C. Marshall, prepared aid rosters, supply lists, and priority categories long before units entered Germany. The American High Command had resolved that military victory alone wasn't enough. Stability would matter more in the long run. The decision clashed violently with what German civilians thought they were walking into. They expected punishment. They expected their conquerors to mirror the catastrophic destruction unleashed by the Third Reich across Europe. Instead, trucks loaded with wheat moved into city centers. Water purification units, designed by engineers from the Army Corps and refined by industrial innovators like the DuPont chemical teams, set up over river inlets still clogged with debris. Cooks from re-echelon field kitchens boiled vats of broth under the cover of ruined rooftops. A medical detachment established triage points beside bomb-cratered intersections, their tents glowing in the dim morning light as corpsmen prepared morphine and sulfa powder. Yet even as aid began, confusion and disbelief spread through German crowds. A voice rose among them, an elderly schoolteacher insisting the Americans were merely fattening civilians before forced labor. Another man shouted warnings that hidden machine guns were surely trained on the street, ready to fire once the crowd assembled. Such panic was not unfounded. Months of total war had eroded trust to dust. In the western districts of the city, a mother clutched her malnourished daughter and asked an American captain why they were helping. The captain replied that orders from above required strict adherence to humanitarian protocols, but the woman couldn't comprehend it. She expected hatred, not help. Behind the visible tension lay a strategic reality often overlooked in reports. By spring 1945, vast swaths of Germany no longer functioned as an organized state. Transportation networks had collapsed under relentless bombing. Food reserves had dwindled to catastrophic lows. Civilians fled through countryside roads in columns stretching for miles, overwhelming any remaining administrative structure. American commanders recognized that uncontrolled starvation would hinder the occupation, ignite rebellion, and fuel guerrilla resistance. Without immediate aid, the post-war landscape would descend into chaos. Reports circulated through command channels, written in terse, factual language by staff officers who had walked through ruined towns, that Germany stood on the edge of a humanitarian abyss. The shock was mutual. While civilians feared American revenge, some American soldiers, having lost friends in Belgium, Normandy, and the Huichin Forest, carried their own emotional scars. Yet orders were orders. General Simpson's directive emphasized that discipline and compassion would define the occupation's opening phase. Any soldier caught mistreating civilians faced court-martial. The result was a remarkable and often disorienting scene. Battle-hardened infantrymen who, just days earlier, had exchanged fire with German units across the Elbe, now handed bread to elderly couples and blankets to children. Relief efforts unfolded in an atmosphere thick with smoke, grief, and disbelief. But beneath the surface of this unexpected mercy lay a deeper story, one not yet visible to the civilians gathering hesitantly at the edges of the distribution line. It was a story shaped by logistics officers, intelligence analysts, agricultural planners, and humanitarian specialists who had been preparing for months. Their work, quiet, unglamorous, easily overshadowed by battlefield heroics, was now unfolding in the streets of a devastated nation. And as American troops tightened their perimeter and prepared for the next wave of supplies to arrive, a single haunting question hung in the air. Why had the U.S. High Command chosen aid over vengeance, and what hidden advantage made this strategy possible? As dawn settled over central Germany in late April 1945, the Americans' unexpected mercy traced back to planning frameworks circulating through 9th Army headquarters, where Staff Under Gen. George C. Marshall anticipated Germany's humanitarian collapse long before the Rhine was crossed. The hidden advantage was logistical integration, an immense system of storage depots, motor pools, rail spurs, and ration plants tied together by engineers who believed food distribution would be as decisive as artillery. A senior planner noted in an autumn 1944 briefing that victory required sustained civilian stability, a phrase that guided the structure now unfolding across a dying Reich. To German civilians, the trucks arriving in their shattered streets looked miraculous. To American commanders, they were simply the end result of months of preparation shaped by industrial science, staff discipline, and a networked army that could move supplies with near-mechanical precision. German officials soon learned the Americans sustained this flow through industrial capacity that defied wartime expectations. Trucks with the White Star carried rations produced on vast American assembly lines, where food engineers at Swift, Armour, and Continental refined preservation methods to extract maximum calories from minimal weight. Powdered eggs, produced using spray-drying techniques perfected by researchers in 1943, fed neighborhoods in ruins. A procurement note recorded that one plant alone processed millions of individual meal units per month. To the Germans, it seemed impossible that an army fighting across a continent could still deliver food on such a scale. Yet every crate represented the labor of chemists, machinists, and quality control teams thousands of miles away, all contributing to an apparatus built to outlast the war itself. Behind every convoy movement lay the true engine of America's advantage, the FM radio. Motorola-designed sets, operating on steady frequencies with reduced static, linked convoys, command posts, depots, and reconnaissance units with unprecedented speed. A logistics officer's April transmission described rerouting 3 truck companies within minutes after a bridge collapse threatened to delay aid. The Germans relied on runners and fragile phone lines. The Americans operated with instant clarity. This network was not improvised. Communication engineers from Army Signal Corps labs had spent years refining frequency stability, antenna geometry, and amplifier reliability. Their work turned radios into the nervous system of the advance, enabling relief operations that moved with the same precision as combat formations. The effectiveness of the system became unmistakable during the critical battle at Haldensleben, fought on 12 April 1945. The U.S. 102nd Infantry Division advanced across open farmland north of the Midland Canal, meeting determined German defenders drawn from battered infantry regiments and ad hoc Volkssturm units. The terrain offered little protection, and German officers expected to bleed the Americans as they crossed exposed ground. Yet within minutes of first contact, the Americans' radio-linked fire support changed the equation. Artillery units waited on coded coordinates, tank destroyers idled with engines warm, liaison pilots circled like steel-winged sentinels above the fields. The Germans fought with courage, but they fought in isolation. At 300 meters, German MG-42 teams opened fire, their bursts cutting through hedges. A single call from a platoon leader brought 105 artillery crashing down, with timing so precise that an observer noted the smoke rose before the gun reports echoed back across the fields. A shattered German squad leader, quoted in a divisional interrogation summary, said the barrage struck faster than thought. The Americans advanced steadily, using radio-guided adjustments to tighten the noose around each strongpoint. As dusk approached, a concealed German flak battery tore into the leading American company. Yet another rapid sequence of radio calls shifted momentum. An L-5 Sentinel liaison pilot relayed exact coordinates to a nearby M-18 Hellcat platoon. Within moments, 76 rounds crashed through the barn, hiding the guns. The speed of this response unnerved German survivors, who later described the Americans as fighting with eyes everywhere, a phrase preserved in a Corps Intelligence Digest. German resistance collapsed in less than an hour. After-action records from the 102nd Division noted roughly 140 German dead and wounded, against fewer than 40 American casualties. Officers concluded that the decisive factor was communication. German units, crippled by severed wires and exhausted messengers, fought blind. The Americans, by contrast, maintained a seamless battlefield dialogue linking infantry, armor, artillery, and air support. With Haldensleben secured, engineers moved in immediately. Signal companies erected antenna masts to extend FM reach across Saxony, while quartermasters surveyed roads and flagged those capable of supporting 5-ton loads. Reconnaissance jeeps patrolled ahead of convoys, relaying updates directly to supply columns. Civilians emerging from basements witnessed the transformation of their town into a logistical hub almost overnight, a process documented in an April Engineer Regiment briefing describing continuous motion under fire-damaged conditions. German officers captured during the battle struggled to reconcile what they had seen. Interrogation transcripts reveal a recurring theme: disbelief that the Americans could synchronize combat and humanitarian logistics with equal precision. One lieutenant told his captors that the U.S. Army fought with factories behind every rifle, an observation reflecting the truth behind the aid lines forming across central Germany. Every coordinated movement relied on thousands of machinists, radio technicians, antenna welders, and depot workers laboring far from the front but influencing every moment of the campaign. In the days between the fall of Haldensleben and the arrival of full relief operations in Magdeburg, the Americans refined their system further. Quartermaster officers cross-checked ration levels against projected refugee inflows, drawing from statistical models created months earlier by agricultural planning teams in Washington. These models, referenced in a February logistics memorandum that warned of civilian movement on a scale unprecedented in modern war, guided how flour, milk, medical kits, and water purification gear were carried forward. These refinements ensured aid could reach thousands who had lost everything utterly. By the time convoys reached Magdeburg, radio-linked logistics had become the quiet backbone of the American presence. Discipline, coordination, and industrial strength converged to enforce strict aid distribution across a defeated foe. German civilians saw mercy. U.S. commanders saw a system functioning exactly as designed. Yet one final layer of the hidden advantage remained unseen, a strategic rationale that reached far beyond radio networks or industrial output, one that would shape the psychological and political foundations of the post-war world. Across the collapsing German heartland, as April bled into May 1945, the Americans' hidden advantage reached beyond convoys, radios, and ration depots. It operated in the minds of soldiers, civilians, and commanders alike, a psychological shield built on discipline, doctrine, and a deliberate refusal to mirror the brutality that had defined so much of the European war. What began as a logistical response to humanitarian catastrophe soon evolved into a strategy shaping the occupation itself. In town after shattered town, German civilians approached American aid stations with trembling hands, unable to comprehend the absence of retaliation. For the soldiers distributing supplies, the tension hung over every interaction. They had buried friends in the Ardennes and Normandy. They had fought through ambushes in the Huichin forest and watched entire cities destroyed by German artillery. Yet strict orders, reinforced through constant reminders from company commanders and military police units, held them to a standard that demanded the opposite of revenge. The effect on German morale was immediate and disorienting. In interrogation centers across the Ninth Army sector, German officers confessed their shock to American analysts compiling daily assessments. One Wehrmacht captain admitted that he had expected American troops to burn every home after capturing his district. Instead, he watched medical teams treat civilians with the same efficiency they applied to wounded soldiers. A psychological warfare summary produced that week noted that the sudden reversal, from fear of annihilation to structured relief, left many Germans unable to reconcile expectation with reality. This confusion weakened potential resistance. It deflated the will of fanatical holdouts who had believed they could rally civilians for last-ditch fighting, and it signaled to survivors that the war, in its most violent form, was truly ending. Yet maintaining this humanitarian posture required an unseen corps of workers and technicians. Mechanics overhauled exhausted trucks at roadside depots. Field kitchen crews, trained by quartermaster food specialists who refined wartime nutrition formulas, prepared meals at a pace that strained endurance. Water purification teams, guided by engineers who had spent years perfecting portable filtration units, operated on riverbanks where corpses and debris still floated. These technicians rarely fired shots, yet they shaped the experience of millions. Their work transformed chaotic ruins into environments where civilians could begin to breathe again. American commanders understood that the morale of both occupiers and the occupied depended on this continuous support. In the broader strategic view, the psychological effect reached far beyond individual towns. The American High Command recognized that Germany's collapse, if unmanaged, could create a power vacuum stretching across Central Europe. Chaos would invite disease, famine, and political fragmentation, conditions enemy intelligence analysts had warned about in reports circulated through Allied headquarters. Stabilizing Germany was essential not just for humanitarian reasons, but to prevent new violence that could claim more lives. Thus, the strict aid policy served both compassion and calculation. By providing security, food, and medical care, the Americans prevented resistance before it could form. They replaced fear with structure. They replaced rumor with routine. And they ensured that millions of civilians would associate the U.S. Army not with vengeance, but with order. The Axis perspective added another layer of complexity. In post-war interrogations conducted months later, former German administrative officials described the profound demoralization that swept through the population as news spread of American aid distribution. One recalled how entire villages collapsed emotionally upon learning that the feared wave of retaliation had not come. Another stated that the Americans' strategic restraint broke the back of every propaganda line the Nazis had used to hold civilians in line. The psychological effect was irreversible. For years, Nazi leaders had claimed that Allied armies would exterminate German families. When that claim evaporated, so too did their last tool of manipulation. The impact extended into the minds of American soldiers as well. Many arrived in Germany carrying deep anger, shaped by battlefield losses and atrocity reports. But the structured humanitarian mission gave them purpose in the uneasy days between fighting and surrender. Medical corpsmen wrote letters home describing how treating German children eased the emotional weight built up during months of combat. Infantrymen tasked with guarding food distribution, lines later told unit historians that enforcing order without cruelty reminded them why they had fought. Their discipline became a psychological anchor for themselves as much as for the civilians they protected. From a doctrinal perspective, the aid strategy set a precedent that would stretch across decades. Military planners studying the German occupation built new frameworks around the concept of stabilization through logistics, a philosophy that later influenced Cold War deployments, Korean War relief missions, and even 1990s peacekeeping doctrine. The same communication networks and logistical models used to feed ruined German towns evolved into the backbone of modern network-centric support systems. Engineers who had once designed portable water systems for riverbanks worked on Cold War-era field sanitation units. Radio technicians who refined FM coordination later contributed to communication protocols enabling synchronized operations in the Gulf War. The lessons of 1945 echoed into every era that followed, yet the legacy was not only technical. the emotional aftermath shaped civilian memory across generations. German families who had expected annihilation instead found American soldiers directing traffic, repairing roads, and distributing meals with mechanical consistency. Diaries recovered from civilians in the Magdeburg region recorded disbelief, gratitude, and the lingering trauma of having expected death instead of bread. In one family account preserved years later, a mother described the sight of an American sergeant handing a chocolate bar to her starving son as the moment the world changed shape. For soldiers who read such accounts in later decades, the stories reinforced the human significance of disciplined mercy, an impact impossible to measure in numbers or reports. In the command posts of the Ninth Army, staff officers tracking the first weeks of occupation noted a dramatic drop in civilian unrest. Towns that had feared reprisal instead began cooperating with American military government teams. Refugee flows stabilized. Local leaders emerged to help distribute supplies. Every small success reduced the pressure on combat units still securing territory. Stability spread not through force, but through predictability, through the steady rhythm of aid trucks guided by radios, maps, and planning systems designed months before the war's end. And beneath all the technical, psychological, and strategic layers lay a simple truth. The Americans chose mercy because they believed it would lay the foundation for a lasting peace. In the smoke-filled ruins of a continent, this principle became the quiet engine of reconstruction. It was not universally followed, nor was it devoid of conflict or failure. But in the spring of 1945, it set a tone that influenced the rebirth of a nation. As the first peace weeks settled over Germany, one American colonel summarized the moment in a line preserved by a division historian, a line that resonance carried across borders and decades. "We cannot change what has been done, but we can choose what the world becomes next."